A village burning under a crimson moon, a nine-tailed monster tearing through rooftops like paper, and one dying wish that would rewrite the fate of the strongest shinobi to ever exist. What if the person who found that abandoned child wasn't kind old Sarutobi, or a loyal shinobi bound by duty, but a man the world would one day call a monster? What if Orochimaru of the Sannin was the one who reached him first? Stick around, because this is a story you have never heard before. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because this journey is going to take us somewhere no other Naruto story has dared to go. Now let's begin. The sky over Konohagakure had turned the color of an open wound. Orochimaru stood on the ridge above the village, half a mile from the walls, and watched the world he had sworn to protect come apart at the seams. Below him, the nine-tailed fox, a mountain of orange fur and boiling malice, swept its claws through a row of barracks as if they were made of straw. Fire bloomed in uneven patches across the rooftops. Somewhere in the chaos, shinobi were dying by the dozen, their chakra signatures flickering out one after another like candles pinched between careless fingers. He should have felt something. Horror, perhaps. Grief. The kind of visceral dread that gripped lesser men at the sight of ruin. Instead, Orochimaru felt only a strange, hollow curiosity. What is causing this? He thought, golden eyes narrowing as he studied the beast's movements. This is no ordinary summoning. No ordinary breach. He had heard whispers. Rumors passed between A and Bu, too shaken to keep their voices steady, that the fox had appeared without warning, torn free from somewhere it should never have been. He was not supposed to be here. His orders, vague as they were, had kept him on the village's southern perimeter, coordinating a defensive line that had long since collapsed into chaos. But Orochimaru had never been a man who followed orders when curiosity called louder. He had slipped away from his post 20 minutes ago, chasing the one question that mattered more to him than the battle itself. Where is Sensei? He found the answer at the top of the Hokage Tower's ruined observation platform, and it was not the answer he wanted. Hiruzen Sarutobi knelt at the platform's edge, his ceremonial robes scorched at the hem, his breathing shallow and uneven. Beside him, wrapped in a bundle of singed cloth, lay something small and impossibly quiet amid all the noise of the world ending. Sensei. Orochimaru's voice came out sharper than he intended, edged with something he refused to name. He crossed the platform in 3 strides, dropping to one knee beside the old man. What happened here? Sarutobi's eyes, tired, ancient, carrying a weight Orochimaru had never seen in them before, lifted to meet his former students. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Below, the fox let out a roar that shook dust from the rafters. Minato, Sarutobi said, and the single word carried an entire tragedy inside it. He and Kushina, they gave everything. Everything, Orochimaru. Orochimaru's gaze dropped to the bundle at Sarutobi's side. The cloth shifted, just slightly, and a small hand emerged, fingers curling weakly in the smoke-thick air. This is their son, Sarutobi continued, and now his voice was fraying at the edges, the composure of a lifetime beginning to crack. Minato used the only technique that could stop the fox. He sealed it, inside his own child. For a long moment, Orochimaru said nothing. He simply looked down at the infant, at the whisker-like marks already forming faint lines across each cheek, scars from a burden no child should ever carry, and felt something shift inside his chest that he could not immediately identify. He had spent his entire life chasing power. Chasing answers to questions no one else dared ask. The nature of the body, the limits of chakra, the boundary between life and death itself. He had watched countless subjects in his private research, cataloging their strengths and failures with the same detachment a botanist might apply to pressed flowers. He told himself, always, that it was in service of Konoha. That knowledge, however uncomfortable, made the village stronger. But looking down at that child, Orochimaru did not see a subject. He saw a weapon the world had already decided to hate before it had drawn its first full breath. They'll turn on him, Orochimaru said quietly. It wasn't a question. Sarutobi's silence was answer enough. The old Hokage's shoulders sagged, and for the first time in Orochimaru's memory, Hiruzen Sarutobi looked truly, completely powerless. The council will see the fox before they see the boy, Sarutobi admitted, each word costing him visible effort. Some will want him controlled. Weaponized. Others, he stopped himself, but Orochimaru understood exactly which name hovered unspoken between them. Danzo had never been subtle about his appetite for tools that could be shaped into instruments of war. And you? Orochimaru's eyes flicked to his old sensei. You would allow this? After everything Minato sacrificed? I have no choice, Sarutobi said, and there was real anguish in it now. I am too weakened to reclaim the mantle and fight the council on every front tonight. I need time. He broke off, coughing, one hand pressed to a wound along his ribs that Orochimaru only now noticed, dark and glistening beneath torn fabric. Orochimaru's hands moved before conscious thought caught up to them, chakra gathering at his fingertips, a diagnostic pulse sweeping over the wound. Old instinct, old loyalty, however buried beneath layers of ambition and secrecy. You're bleeding out, Orochimaru said flatly. I am aware, Sarutobi replied, with the ghost of dry humor that somehow still survived even now. Then his expression sobered, and he reached out, not toward his own injury, but toward the bundle beside him, resting one weathered hand against the child's tiny shoulder. Orochimaru. Sarutobi's voice dropped, quiet enough that it might have been lost beneath the roar of battle below if Orochimaru hadn't leaned in to catch every syllable. I am asking you something I have no right to ask. Something I would never ask if the night had left me any other option. Orochimaru went very still. Take him, Sarutobi said. Take Naruto, and disappear. The words landed like a physical blow. Whatever Orochimaru had expected from this conversation, orders to help contain the fox, instructions to secure the tower, even a request to hunt down whoever had orchestrated tonight's disaster, it had not been this. You cannot be serious, Orochimaru said. I have never been more serious in my life. Sarutobi's grip on the child tightened, protective even in his weakened state. If he stays here, in the village, under the council's eye, they will smother him with fear before he ever has the chance to become who he might be. Danzo will see only a weapon. The clan heads will see only the monster that killed their kin tonight. Even the kindest among them will see a burden to be managed, not a boy to be raised. And you believe I am the better alternative? Orochimaru's voice carried an edge of something almost like bitter laughter. Sensei, you know exactly what I am. What I've done, what I continue to do, in the dark corners you pretend not to notice. I know precisely what you are, Sarutobi said, and his eyes, even now, even bleeding, even exhausted past the point most men could bear, held Orochimaru's gaze without flinching. I know you better than any council member ever will. I have watched you your entire life. Orochimaru. I watched a boy who lost everyone he loved turn his grief into a hunger for answers the world refused to give him. I watched ambition curdle into something colder with each passing year, but I have never once watched you enjoy the suffering of others for its own sake. You are not cruel. You are curious, and lost, and searching for something you have never quite been able to name. Orochimaru's jaw tightened. He wanted to argue. The words rose in his throat, sharp and defensive. You know nothing of what drives me, old man, but they died there, unspoken, because some small, traitorous part of him recognized the truth in what Sarutobi had said. This village will fail him, Sarutobi continued, softer now, more urgent as his strength visibly waned. I have seen enough of the future in the eyes of frightened men tonight to know it. But you have spent your whole life obsessed with potential. With what a person could become, if only given the right conditions to grow. I am asking you to apply that obsession to something other than a scalpel and a research log. I am asking you to give this child a chance no one else in this village will be willing to give him. Below them, the fox roared again, and in the distance, a new chakra signature flared to life, massive, familiar, achingly powerful. Minato, in whatever form his sacrifice had taken, making his final stand. Orochimaru looked down at the child once more. Naruto. Even the name felt strange in his mind, foreign and new. The boy's eyes had opened, impossibly steady for an infant surrounded by chaos, staring up at the smoke-choked sky as though trying to memorize the shape of the destruction that had already claimed everything he would never remember having. If I do this, Orochimaru said slowly, each word tested and weighed before he allowed it past his lips, the council will call it kidnapping. Treason. They will hunt us both. Then you disappear completely, Sarutobi said. Not as Orochimaru of the Sannin. Not as a missing nin with a bounty on his head. You become no one. A ghost. I will handle the council. I will tell them what needs to be told, by what time can be bought. But I need you to understand, Orochimaru, that if you take this path, there may be no coming back from it, not for a very long time. Perhaps not ever. There it was. The full weight of the request laid bare. Orochimaru had built his entire life around control, around the certainty of knowledge, the safety of predictable outcomes, the comfort of experiments he could measure and record and understand. What Sarutobi was asking of him now offered none of that. A child was not a variable that could be isolated and studied in a sealed chamber. A child was chaos given a heartbeat, unpredictable in every direction, demanding things Orochimaru had never allowed himself to want. Time. Patience. Attachment. And yet, he thought of his own childhood, the empty house, the silence where parents should have been, the years spent chasing the approval of a sensei who could never quite fill the hollow left behind by loss. He thought of every experiment he had conducted in secret, every forbidden technique he had chased in the name of transcending human limitation, and understood, with sudden and uncomfortable clarity, exactly what he had actually been searching for all these years. Not power for its own sake. Meaning. Purpose. Something to anchor the endless hunger inside him to a reason worth having. If the council believes I acted alone, Orochimaru said finally, if they believe this was theft rather than your design, you might weather the storm without implicating yourself. Sarutobi's expression flickered with something like relief, though exhaustion dulled its edges. That is precisely what I intend to tell them. And if I fail him? Orochimaru's voice, for the first time that night, cracked with something almost like vulnerability. If I raise a monster instead of a man, then the fault will be no greater than if this village had raised him with fear in every glance, Sarutobi said. But I do not believe that is what will happen. I have faith in you, Orochimaru. More faith, perhaps, than you have ever had in yourself. Below them, the massive form of the fox let out one final, earth-shaking roar, and then, impossibly, began to shrink. The battle was ending. Minato's technique, whatever final cost it had exacted, had worked. There was no more time to deliberate. Orochimaru reached down and gathered the child into his arms. Naruto was lighter than he expected, and warmer, his tiny body radiating heat that Orochimaru's trained senses immediately recognized as something far beyond ordinary infant chakra. Dense. Layered. Something ancient coiled beneath something newly born, like two separate rivers running through the same channel. Orochimaru's scientific mind catalogued the sensation even as something entirely unscientific tightened in his chest at the way the boy's small fingers curled instinctively against the fabric of his sleeve. Take the seal notes, Sarutobi said, pressing a small scroll case into Orochimaru's free hand with what remained of his strength. Kushina's research. Everything she documented about the seal, about the boy's chakra network. You will need it, if you intend to raise him properly rather than simply keep him hidden. Orochimaru accepted the case, tucking it away with the same careful precision he applied to any piece of critical research. And you, Sensei? You cannot stand here bleeding while the village searches for its Hokage. I will manage, Sarutobi said, and though his voice was weak, there was steel beneath it, the steel that had made him Hokage in the first place. Go. Now, before the search parties reach the tower. Every minute you remain increases the danger to you both. Orochimaru rose, the child cradled carefully against his chest, and for one long moment, he looked back at his old sensei, bleeding, broken, alone atop a tower overlooking a village in ruins. Thank you, Sarutobi said quietly, for trusting an old man's final, desperate request. Don't thank me yet, Orochimaru replied, and something in his tone had already begun to shift, colder, more focused. The sound of a man committing fully to an impossible task. Thank me in 15 years, if this boy has grown into something the world does not immediately try to destroy. And then he was gone, vanishing into the smoke-choked night with the last surviving legacy of the fourth Hokage held close against the heart that had, for the first time in longer than Orochimaru cared to admit, remembered how to feel something other than curiosity. Konoha's outer wall passed beneath him in a blur of shadow and moonlight. Orochimaru moved with the practiced silence of a man who had spent decades perfecting the art of not being seen, weaving through alleys and back paths that most shinobi didn't know existed, avoiding the scattered patrols still coordinating the village's emergency response. Behind him, the fires continued to burn, casting an orange glow against the low clouds that made the entire sky look like it, too, had been wounded. Naruto stayed remarkably quiet throughout the journey, not asleep, but watchful, his wide eyes tracking the passing shadows with an alertness that unsettled Orochimaru more than any crying infant could have. Most babies, he imagined, would have been screaming through an ordeal like this. This one simply watched, as though some instinctive part of him already understood that silence, tonight, meant survival. Clever, Orochimaru thought, and was surprised by the flicker of something that felt uncomfortably close to pride. He reached the eastern perimeter an hour before dawn, where a narrow gap in the wall's patrol coverage, one of several such gaps Orochimaru had mapped years ago during research expeditions that the village had never fully sanctioned, offered a path beyond Konoha's borders without triggering a single alarm seal. He paused there, just for a moment, looking back at the village he had called home for his entire life. Smoke still rose in thin columns against the paling sky. Somewhere behind those walls, shinobi were counting their dead, clan heads were already scheming about how to shape the narrative of tonight's disaster, and a broken old man was preparing to weather a storm of political fury on behalf of a decision only the two of them shared. Orochimaru had left Konoha before, on countless research expeditions, some sanctioned and many not. But this felt different. This felt final in a way none of those previous departures ever had. He looked down at the child in his arms. "You have no idea what you've just cost me," he murmured, low enough that the words were barely more than breath. "Or what you've cost yourself, for that matter. Growing up under my roof is hardly the childhood any sane person would wish upon an infant." Naruto blinked up at him, and perhaps it was exhaustion, perhaps it was simply the play of pale dawn light against small features, but for one fleeting instant, Orochimaru could have sworn the boy's expression held something almost like understanding. "Humph," Orochimaru said, and allowed himself the barest ghost of a smile. "Perhaps that makes two of us who don't quite know what we're doing." He turned his back on Konoha's walls and stepped beyond the tree line, chakra already gathering beneath his feet to carry him swiftly toward the network of hidden research outposts he had spent years establishing across the Land of Fire's more remote territories. Places built originally for solitary experimentation, now about to be repurposed for something Orochimaru had never once planned for: a home. The word felt foreign even as he thought it. He had not had a home, not truly, not since he was a child himself, watching his own parents die in circumstances that had shaped every choice he'd made since. He had built laboratories, hideouts, research facilities disguised as abandoned temples and forgotten shrines. But a home, a place meant not for discovery, but for raising a child to adulthood, was something entirely outside his experience. "I will simply have to learn," he told himself, with the same clinical determination he applied to any new field of study. "I have mastered forbidden techniques that killed lesser men in the attempt. I have unraveled secrets of the body that the world's greatest medical minds declared impossible. Raising one child cannot possibly prove more difficult than that." He would, in time, discover exactly how wrong that assumption was. But for now, as the sun began to rise over the Land of Fire, and Konoha's burning silhouette shrank into the distance behind him, Orochimaru of the Sannin ran through the forest with Naruto Uzumaki held carefully against his chest, carrying with him not just an orphaned infant, but the first true purpose he had felt in longer than he could remember. 3 days later, deep in a research outpost hidden within a forgotten valley 200 miles from Konoha's borders, Orochimaru sat at a worn wooden desk, Kushina sealing notes, spread open before him, and stared at a set of readings that made absolutely no sense. He had drawn a small chakra sample from Naruto that morning, a routine diagnostic, nothing invasive, simply an attempt to understand exactly what he was dealing with. He'd expected to find traces of the fox's chakra intermingled with the boy's own developing network. Perhaps even some early volatility given how fresh the seal was. What he had not expected was this. The readings showed 2 distinct chakra signatures, yes, one unmistakably belonging to the sealed fox, coiled and simmering with barely contained malevolence. But the second signature, the boy's own natural chakra, carried properties Orochimaru had never encountered in 15 years of dedicated research into bloodlines, dojutsu, and the outer limits of human chakra potential, layered, dense beyond anything a normal infant should possess. And underlying it all, a strange harmonic pattern that reminded him, though he dismissed the thought as absurd almost as soon as it formed, of fragmented references he'd once encountered in ancient, half-destroyed texts describing the legendary origin of chakra itself. Orochimaru set down his brush, golden eyes narrowing as he glanced across the room to where Naruto lay sleeping in a makeshift crib fashioned from a converted storage crate, softened with whatever spare fabric the outpost had on hand. What exactly, he murmured to the empty room, did I just carry out of that burning village? He had no answer. Not yet. But some deep, old part of him, the part that had spent his entire life chasing mysteries too dangerous for other men to touch, felt a familiar thrill stirring beneath the surface of his composure. Whatever this child was, whatever secrets slept coiled within his chakra network waiting for the right conditions to awaken, Orochimaru intended to understand every single one of them, not to exploit. Not this time. To protect. He rose from the desk and crossed the small room, looking down at the sleeping infant with an expression he did not yet have the vocabulary to name. Somewhere behind Konoha's walls, a grieving village was piecing together the story of a tragedy. A broken Hokage was fielding furious questions from a council hungry for someone to blame, and rumors were already beginning to spread about a mysterious disappearance connected to the chaos of that terrible night. But here, in this quiet valley far from prying eyes, none of that mattered yet. Here, there was only a man learning, for the very first time in his complicated, ambition-scarred life, what it might mean to raise something instead of merely studying it. And somewhere deep within the boy's tiny, sleeping form, something ancient and powerful stirred in response to a warmth it had never expected to find. A warmth that would, in time, awaken eyes the shinobi world had not seen in living memory. But that is a story for another chapter. The outpost had never been meant for a child. Orochimaru stood in the center of what had once served as his primary research chamber. Stone walls lined with shelves of scrolls, jars of preserved specimens, and diagrams charting chakra pathways in more detail than any Konoha medical text dared publish. A month ago, this room had represented the pinnacle of everything he valued, knowledge pursued without the constraints of squeamish ethics committees or nervous clan elders peering over his shoulder. Now, it represented a problem. He looked down at Naruto, currently occupying the converted storage crate that served as a makeshift crib, and then back at the rows of specimen jars lining the nearest shelf, several of which contained things no child should ever lay eyes on, let alone an infant who would, inevitably, someday learn to crawl toward anything that caught his curious attention. This will not do, Orochimaru muttered, already calculating renovations with the same clinical precision he once reserved for surgical procedures. Over the following days, the outpost underwent a transformation that would have baffled anyone who thought they understood Orochimaru of the Sannin. Specimen jars were relocated to a sealed sub-basement level, accessible only through a chakra-lock door. Dangerous scrolls were catalogued and stored in reinforced containers. An entire wing of the facility, previously used for storing research equipment, was cleared out, scrubbed down, and slowly, awkwardly, converted into something resembling living quarters. Orochimaru had never built a home before. He discovered, in the process, that it was considerably more difficult than building a laboratory. Where does one even acquire furniture? He asked the empty room one afternoon, staring at a hand-drawn sketch of what he believed a crib was supposed to look like, based entirely on second-hand descriptions gleaned from medical texts on infant care. He had, of course, never needed to concern himself with such trivialities before. His research subjects did not require nurseries. He solved the problem the way he solved most problems, through meticulous study and improvisation. He requisitioned materials from a nearby town, under a disguise, paying in coin obtained through means he did not examine too closely, and spent an embarrassing number of hours constructing a proper crib from raw lumber, consulting his own diagrams with the same intensity he once reserved for forbidden jutsu research. The finished product was, by any objective measure, over-engineered. It included reinforced joints capable of withstanding considerably more stress than any infant could realistically generate, a chakra-dampening ward woven subtly into the wood grain in case Naruto's unusual energy proved volatile during sleep, and measurements calculated down to the millimeter based on projected growth rates for a child of Uzumaki and Namikaze's heritage. It's a crib, not a fortress, Orochimaru said to himself, surveying his work with something between pride and mild embarrassment. Then, after a pause, though I suppose, in this case, perhaps it should be both. The early weeks tested every ounce of patience Orochimaru possessed, and Orochimaru, by his own admission, had never possessed particularly much of it. He was a man accustomed to precision. Chakra control could be studied, refined, mastered through rigorous practice. Techniques could be broken down into component parts and reassembled with surgical exactness. Even the human body, in all its complexity, ultimately obeyed rules that a sufficiently dedicated researcher could uncover given enough time. An infant, Orochimaru quickly discovered, obeyed no such rules. I have successfully replicated forbidden techniques that cost other shinobi their lives in the attempt, he informed Naruto one particularly trying evening, 3 weeks into their new arrangement, as the boy screamed with what seemed to be genuinely impressive lung capacity for someone so small. I have unraveled cellular regeneration sequences that baffled the greatest medical minds of this generation, and yet I cannot determine why you are currently attempting to wake every creature within a 5-mile radius. The crying continued undiminished by his logical appeal. Orochimaru tried, in rapid succession, every remedy his research had suggested, checking for hunger, checking for discomfort, adjusting the temperature of the room, even, in a moment of genuine desperation, attempting to recreate a soothing chakra pulse he vaguely recalled reading about in a medical text on infant care. Nothing worked. It was only when he picked Naruto up, more out of frustrated helplessness than any confidence it would help, and began pacing the length of the chamber while muttering under his breath about the chemical composition of stomach acid, that the crying finally began to subside. Orochimaru stopped mid-sentence, staring down at the now quiet infant in his arms. You simply wanted to be held, he said, equal parts disbelief and something almost like reluctant fondness creeping into his voice. All of that, over something so simple. He would, in the weeks that followed, learn that very little about raising a child was simple. But he would also learn, slowly, awkwardly, in ways that surprised him more than any breakthrough in his research ever had, that he did not entirely mind the learning. By the time Naruto was 6 months old, Orochimaru had developed what he privately referred to as a research schedule for his care, though anyone observing from the outside might simply have called it parenting. Mornings were devoted to feeding, monitoring, and the kind of careful observation Orochimaru applied to any subject of genuine scientific interest, though he was increasingly forced to admit that his interest in Naruto had stopped being purely scientific rather earlier than he was comfortable acknowledging. He tracked the boy's development against every medical benchmark he could locate: growth patterns, motor skill progression, the timing of his first attempts at rolling over, sitting up, reaching for objects with increasing coordination. What fascinated him most, however, was the chakra. Naruto's chakra network developed at a pace that defied every reference text Orochimaru consulted. By 6 months, most infants showed only the faintest, most rudimentary traces of coherent chakra flow, unfocused, chaotic, years away from anything resembling control. Naruto's network, by contrast, had already begun forming patterns of unusual density along pathways that, according to Kushina's notes, corresponded to areas associated with the Uzumaki clan's naturally massive chakra reserves. But it was more than that. Woven beneath the Uzumaki foundation, intertwined with threads of the sealed fox's chakra, Orochimaru detected something else entirely, a third layer, fainter but unmistakably present, that resonated with an almost rhythmic quality unlike anything catalogued in any text he possessed. "What are you?" Orochimaru murmured one evening, watching Naruto's small hands glow faintly with barely perceptible chakra as the boy reached toward a hanging mobile Orochimaru had fashioned from scrap metal, an old kunai, a compromise between infant entertainment and Orochimaru's own inability to resist incorporating shinobi tools into virtually everything he built. Naruto, of course, offered no answer beyond a delighted giggle as his fingers brushed against the swinging metal, small sparks of chakra flickering at his fingertips in a way that made Orochimaru's breath catch. Controlled discharge, Orochimaru noted internally, already mentally cataloging the observation for later study. At 6 months. Unprecedented. He found himself, more and more often, setting aside his broader research ambitions in favor of simply watching the boy, not as a scientist cataloging data points, but as something closer to what he suspected other people might call a parent, though he was reluctant to use that word even in the privacy of his own thoughts. The isolation of their hidden life was, in some ways, a mercy. No prying eyes. No council members whispering about the danger a Jinchuriki represented. No frightened villagers flinching away from whisker-marked cheeks. Naruto grew in a world where the only judgment he faced came from a man who found himself, against every expectation, incapable of viewing the boy as anything other than someone worth protecting. But the isolation carried its own difficulties. Orochimaru had spent his adult life surrounded, however coldly, by the infrastructure of Konoha's shinobi world, fellow Sannin, students, colleagues in research, even the distant, complicated respect of a village that had once considered him one of its most brilliant sons. Raising a child in near total seclusion meant confronting questions he had never needed to answer before. What do I tell him, when he is old enough to ask about his parents? What do I tell him about why the world outside these walls would want him dead, or worse, controlled? What do I tell him about myself? These questions circled Orochimaru's mind during quiet hours, usually late at night, as he reviewed Kushina's sealing notes by candlelight, while Naruto slept soundly nearby. The notes were extensive, clearly the work of a woman who had poured every ounce of maternal anxiety into ensuring her son's safety, even knowing she might not survive to raise him herself. Detailed diagrams of the 8 trigram seal. Careful annotations about chakra balance, about the delicate relationship between Jinchuriki and tailed beasts that needed to be nurtured rather than suppressed if the boy was to grow up whole rather than fractured. She loved him more than her own life, Orochimaru thought, tracing one finger along Kushina's careful handwriting. And I am the one left to see that love carried forward. The weight of that responsibility settled differently than any burden he had carried before. His research, however dangerous, however forbidden, had always ultimately been his own to bear. The consequences of his choices, whatever they might be, belonged to him alone. This was different. This was a responsibility that extended beyond himself, toward a life that depended entirely on his judgment, his patience, his willingness to be something other than the man he had spent decades becoming. I am not equipped for this, Orochimaru admitted quietly to the sleeping infant one night, setting aside Kushina's notes, and simply watching Naruto's small chest rise and fall with steady, peaceful breath. I have spent my life pursuing power and knowledge with no regard for anything so fragile as another person's well-being. And now here you are, entirely dependent on a man who has never once prioritized anyone's survival above his own curiosity. Naruto, asleep, offered no response beyond a small, contented sound and the faint flicker of chakra along his fingertips, a habit Orochimaru had noticed occurred most often during the deepest stages of sleep, as though something ancient stirred even in the boy's dreams. Perhaps, Orochimaru continued, voice barely above a whisper, that is precisely why Sensei chose me for this. Not despite what I am. Because of it. Who better to protect something extraordinary than a man who has spent his entire life chasing the extraordinary, wherever it might be found? It was, he reflected, the closest thing to a truce he had yet made with himself regarding the strange, unplanned turn his life had taken. As Naruto approached his first year, Orochimaru began incorporating more structured elements into their routine. Not formal training, not yet, but the earliest foundations of the discipline that would eventually define the boy's upbringing. He began with simple things, guiding Naruto's hands through basic movements meant to encourage coordination, speaking to him constantly and deliberately in full sentences rather than the simplified baby talk most caregivers defaulted to, exposing him early to the shapes and structures of hand seals, not expecting comprehension, but building familiarity that Orochimaru theorized might accelerate later learning. Repetition builds pathways, he explained to Naruto during one such session, demonstrating the ram seal slowly, deliberately, as the boy watched with the intense focus that had already become one of his most distinctive traits. Even if you do not yet understand what you are seeing, your mind is recording the pattern. When the time comes for you to learn these seals in earnest, the foundation will already exist. Naruto, for his part, seemed endlessly fascinated by these sessions, reaching out with small hands to mimic the shapes Orochimaru formed, giggling with delight whenever he managed even a rough approximation. It was during one such session, 3 months shy of Naruto's first birthday, that Orochimaru witnessed something that would send him back to Kushina's notes, with renewed, almost frantic urgency. Naruto, attempting to mimic the tiger seal, had grown frustrated when his small fingers refused to cooperate, and in a burst of infant temper, had slammed both hands against the floor. The resulting discharge of chakra was small, barely more than a flicker, but it carried a distinctive resonance that made every hair on Orochimaru's body stand on end. The wooden floorboards beneath Naruto's hands had, for just an instant, seemed to ripple, not shatter, not burn, but genuinely ripple, as though gravity itself had briefly forgotten its usual rules in a small radius around the boy's palms. Orochimaru went very still. "Say that again," he said, voice tight with an intensity that momentarily startled Naruto out of his frustration. "Do it again, exactly as you just did." Naruto, confused by the sudden shift in his guardian's demeanor, simply blinked up at him with wide, curious eyes. The moment, whatever it had been, already passed. Orochimaru spent the remainder of that night, and several nights following, running every diagnostic he could devise, searching for any trace of the phenomenon he had witnessed. He found nothing conclusive, no repeat occurrence, no lingering chakra signature beyond what he had already documented in Naruto's network. But the memory of that brief, gravity-defying ripple lodged itself in his mind and refused to leave. Ancient texts speak of techniques that manipulate gravitational and attractive forces at a fundamental level, he thought, pulling out fragile, half-translated scrolls he had acquired years ago during research expeditions to sites most shinobi considered too dangerous or too mythical to bother investigating. Techniques attributed to legends so old most scholars dismissed them as fabrication. He found himself, late one night, staring at a particularly weathered fragment depicting a figure with rippling, patterned eyes, a figure the fragment referred to only in reverent, half-legible script that Orochimaru had once dismissed as religious embellishment rather than historical record. He did not yet make the connection fully. The evidence remained too thin, the incident too brief and unrepeated to draw firm conclusions. But some instinct, the same instinct that had guided every significant discovery of his research career, told him that whatever slept within Naruto's chakra network extended far beyond what even Kushina's most detailed notes had anticipated. "I will need to be patient," he told himself, setting the fragile scroll aside. "Whatever this is, it will reveal itself in its own time. My task, for now, is simply to ensure he survives long enough to grow into it." Naruto's first birthday arrived quietly, marked by nothing more elaborate than a small cake Orochimaru had attempted to bake himself. A disaster of an endeavor that resulted in something closer to dense, slightly burned bread than any recognizable dessert, sweetened with honey, which Orochimaru had never kept in the outpost regardless. "I am considerably better at synthesizing complex poisons than I am at baking," Orochimaru admitted, surveying the misshapen result with genuine disappointment. "Perhaps that should concern me more than it does." Naruto, blissfully unconcerned with the aesthetic failures of his birthday cake, simply reached out and grabbed a fistful of it with characteristic enthusiasm, smearing more of it across his own face than actually reached his mouth. Orochimaru watched the boy with an expression that had, over the past year, grown steadily less guarded, something that might, in a less complicated man, have simply been called warmth. "1 year," he said quietly, more to himself than to Naruto. "1 year since I made a decision that upended everything I believed about the trajectory of my life. And do you know, I find myself with remarkably few regrets about it." He thought briefly of the life he had left behind, the research he might have continued unimpeded, the freedom he had once possessed to pursue any forbidden avenue of study without the responsibility of another life depending on his judgment. He thought, too, of Konoha, of Sarutobi weathering whatever political storm had followed their disappearance, of a village he had once called home that now existed to him only as memory and calculated risk. Does Sensei still live? He wondered, not for the first time. He had no way of confirming it. Any attempt to gather intelligence on Konoha's internal affairs risked exposing their location, and Orochimaru was not willing to gamble Naruto's safety for the sake of his own curiosity, however much it gnawed at him. He would, eventually, find ways to gather fragments of information, carefully, indirectly, through channels that could not be traced back to their hidden outpost. But for now, in this quiet moment with a 1-year-old smearing burnt honey cake across his face, Orochimaru allowed himself simply to exist in the present, unburdened by the uncertainties of a world he had deliberately chosen to step away from. "Happy birthday, Naruto," he said, and meant it with a sincerity that would have shocked anyone who had known him before that fateful night atop the Hokage Tower. As the months continued to pass, Orochimaru's approach to raising Naruto began to solidify into something resembling a genuine philosophy, one built, characteristically, on rigorous observation and careful theory, but increasingly tempered by instincts that owed less to scientific detachment and more to something Orochimaru might once have dismissed as sentiment. He decided early on that Naruto would not grow up sheltered from the reality of what he carried within him. Kushina's notes had been clear on this point, and Orochimaru found himself in rare, complete agreement with a woman he had never met. A Jinchuriki raised in ignorance of their burden was a Jinchuriki set up for eventual catastrophe. Better, Orochimaru reasoned, that Naruto grow up understanding the fox not as some shameful secret to be hidden away, but as a reality to be studied, respected, and eventually, Orochimaru hoped, reconciled with. He also decided, with equal conviction, that Naruto's unusual chakra abilities, whatever they might eventually reveal themselves to be, would be cultivated through patient discipline rather than reckless exploitation. He had, after all, spent his career witnessing the consequences of power pursued without adequate foundation. Shinobi who burned through their own chakra coils in pursuit of techniques beyond their control. Bloodlines awakened prematurely and left to fester into instability rather than strength. Whatever sleeps within you, he thought, watching Naruto attempt his increasingly coordinated first steps across the chamber floor, small hands outstretched for balance. I will ensure you are given the discipline to wield it, rather than the recklessness to be consumed by it. This philosophy would, in the years that followed, define nearly every aspect of Naruto's upbringing, a careful balance between nurturing extraordinary potential and instilling the patience necessary to control it. It was, in many ways, the opposite of how Orochimaru had once pursued his own forbidden research, not power at any cost, but power tempered by genuine care for the person who would wield it. He did not always succeed in maintaining that balance. There would be moments, in the years ahead, where his old instincts, the hunger for discovery, the temptation to push boundaries further and faster than caution advised, would resurface, testing the fragile transformation he had undergone. But in these early years, with Naruto still small enough to fit comfortably in the crook of one arm, Orochimaru found the discipline surprisingly easy to maintain. Perhaps, he reflected one evening, watching Naruto sleep peacefully in the reinforced crib he had built with his own hands, it was simply easier to be patient with someone you had come, against every expectation, to genuinely love. He did not use that word aloud, not yet. Some transformations took longer to fully acknowledge than others, but the truth of it lived in every small gesture of his daily life, in the careful modifications he made to the outpost to ensure Naruto's safety, in the hours spent poring over medical texts to better understand infant development, in the quiet satisfaction he felt watching the boy grow stronger and more curious with each passing week. Orochimaru of the Sannin, feared throughout the shinobi world for research so dangerous it had driven lesser men to madness, had become, however unexpectedly, something considerably simpler, a father. By the time Naruto celebrated his second birthday, this time with a cake that Orochimaru had, through sheer stubborn determination, managed to bake successfully, the foundations of their unusual life together had settled into a rhythm that felt, for the first time, genuinely sustainable. The outpost had transformed considerably from the cold research facility it had once been. Naruto's presence had softened its edges in ways Orochimaru could not have predicted, scattered toys carved from spare wood, small handprints occasionally marking the walls where the boy had reached out with chakra-tinged fingers during moments of excitement, the persistent, cheerful noise of a growing child filling spaces that had once known only silence and solitary study. You have made this place considerably less efficient as a research facility, Orochimaru informed Naruto one afternoon, watching the boy attempt to stack a small tower of wooden blocks with fierce, determined concentration. And yet I find myself remarkably unconcerned by that fact. Naruto, absorbed in his tower building, offered no response beyond a small sound of triumph as his stack reached a precarious 4 blocks high before toppling over entirely. His frustrated wail was followed almost immediately by renewed determination, small hands already reaching to rebuild what had fallen. Persistent, Orochimaru noted, watching with something between scientific interest and genuine parental pride. He does not simply accept failure. he immediately seeks to correct it. It was a trait Orochimaru recognized uncomfortably, as something of a mirror to his own defining characteristic, though where his own persistence had, over the years, curdled into obsession untethered from restraint, he found himself hoping fiercely that Naruto's version of the trait might grow into something healthier. Something built on resilience rather than desperation, he thought, watching the boy rebuild his tower for the third time, of the years ahead, of training that would need to begin in earnest soon, of dangers that lurked beyond the borders of their hidden valley, of a world that remained, even now, unaware of exactly what quietly grew within these walls. He thought, too, of the strange chakra phenomenon he had witnessed months ago, the brief, gravity-defying ripple that had sent him scouring ancient texts for answers he had not yet found. It had not repeated since, but Orochimaru had not forgotten it. Some patient, watchful part of him remained convinced that whatever slept within Naruto's chakra network would, eventually, awaken in full. When it does, he thought, I intend to be ready. Not to exploit what emerges. To guide it. To ensure that whatever power stirs within you finds discipline rather than chaos. For now, though, there was only a 2-year-old boy rebuilding a fallen tower of blocks, laughing with pure, uncomplicated delight each time he succeeded, and a former Sannin who found himself, against every prediction he might once have made about his own life, entirely content to simply watch. Again, Naruto said, one of his first clear words, delivered with the same fierce determination he brought to everything, pointing at the scattered blocks. Orochimaru, despite himself, smiled. Again, he agreed, and knelt down to help rebuild the tower. 6 years is a long time to keep a secret. Orochimaru had come to understand this with the particular clarity of a man who had spent every one of those years watching his own shadow more carefully than he watched the horizon. The outpost had moved twice in that time, not from any direct threat, but from the accumulated weight of caution, the instinct that told him no hiding place remained truly hidden forever. Their current home sat nestled in a forested valley near the border of the Land of Fire and the Land of Rivers, chosen specifically for its isolation and the natural chakra-dampening properties of the mineral-rich rock formations that surrounded it. Naruto, now 6 years old, had grown into a whirlwind of restless energy and relentless curiosity. A far cry from the quiet, watchful infant Orochimaru had carried out of a burning village. His hair had grown wild and untamed, impossible to keep flat despite Orochimaru's several increasingly exasperated attempts. His eyes, still ordinary blue in their resting state, held an intensity that made grown shinobi twice his age uncomfortable, on the rare occasions any outsider caught even a fleeting glimpse of him. Again, Naruto said, for what Orochimaru estimated to be the 14th time that morning, wobbling slightly as he attempted to hold a basic stance Orochimaru had demonstrated only minutes before. Orochimaru watched from a few feet away, arms crossed, expression carefully neutral despite the small flicker of satisfaction he felt at the boy's persistence. Your center of balance is too high. Bend your knees further. Naruto adjusted, brow furrowed in concentration, tongue poking slightly from the corner of his mouth in a habit Orochimaru privately found endearing, though he would never have admitted as much aloud. Better, Orochimaru allowed. Hold it. It had been 6 months since Orochimaru decided the time had come to begin Naruto's formal training in earnest, 6 months since he had set aside the gentler lessons of early childhood in favor of something more structured, more demanding. The decision had not come easily. Every research text he consulted, every fragment of shinobi pedagogy he could recall from his own training under the third Hokage decades ago, suggested that formal taijutsu training typically began closer to age 7 or 8, once a child's body had developed sufficient coordination and physical resilience. But Naruto was not an ordinary child, and Orochimaru had never been an ordinary teacher. You're rushing, Orochimaru said, watching Naruto's stance waver as impatience crept back into the boy's posture. Discipline is not about speed, Naruto. It is about precision repeated until precision becomes instinct. But I want to learn the cool stuff, Naruto said, dropping the stance entirely to look up at his guardian with the particular pleading expression he had perfected over the past year, an expression that Orochimaru had, through considerable effort, trained himself to resist. The cool stuff, as you call it, will kill you if attempted without proper foundation, Orochimaru replied, unmoved. I have watched shinobi far older than you burn through their own chakra coils attempting techniques beyond their control. I have no intention of allowing that fate to befall you. Now, stance. Naruto huffed, a small sound of frustration that had, over the years, become one of Orochimaru's favorite indicators of the boy's determination rather than genuine complaint, but he reset his stance without further argument. Orochimaru had learned, over 6 years of raising this particular child, that Naruto responded far better to clear expectations and consistent boundaries than to indulgence. It was, in some ways, ironic. Orochimaru himself had spent his life chafing against boundaries, pushing past every limitation the world attempted to impose on his research. But watching Naruto, he understood something he had never quite grasped about his own upbringing. Boundaries, properly applied, were not cages. They were scaffolding, structure that allowed genuine strength to grow along a stable frame rather than collapsing under its own untested weight. Good, Orochimaru said, studying the corrected stance with a critical eye. Now again. And this time, breathe properly. You are holding your breath, which tightens your muscles and slows your reactions. The mornings, in this new phase of their life together, belonged to physical training. Orochimaru had designed a curriculum with the same meticulous care he once applied to his most ambitious research projects. Basic stances, footwork drills, simple strikes and blocks, all calibrated carefully to Naruto's developing body and, more importantly, to the boy's unusually dense chakra reserves. That density presented its own unique challenges. Most children Naruto's age possessed chakra reserves so small that basic control exercises focused primarily on simply learning to sense and gather chakra at all. Naruto, by contrast, already possessed reserves that Orochimaru estimated rivaled those of a mid-level genin, if not higher, a legacy, he suspected, of both his Uzumaki heritage and the fox sealed within him, whose chakra occasionally bled subtly into Naruto's own network in ways that complicated every control exercise Orochimaru devised. Your problem, Orochimaru explained one afternoon, as Naruto attempted, and failed, for the 6th consecutive time, to hold a leaf stuck to his forehead using only concentrated chakra, is not a lack of chakra. It is an excess of it, combined with an absence of the fine control necessary to regulate that excess. So I have too much chakra, Naruto said, flopping backward onto the grass with the particular dramatic exhaustion only a 6-year-old could properly convey. That doesn't sound like a problem. That sounds awesome. It is a problem, Orochimaru corrected, because raw power without control is simply a disaster waiting for an opportunity to occur. A shinobi with modest reserves and excellent control will consistently outperform a shinobi with vast reserves and poor discipline. Power is only as useful as the precision with which it is applied. Naruto squinted up at him from the grass. You always say stuff like that. Like a fortune cookie. I do not know what a fortune cookie is, Orochimaru said, with the particular flat dignity of a man choosing not to investigate a tangent he suspected would prove unproductive, but I will take that as evidence that my lessons are at least memorable, if perhaps insufficiently appreciated in the moment. Naruto laughed, a bright, unguarded sound that never failed to catch Orochimaru slightly off guard, even after 6 years of hearing it regularly. There was something in that laugh, in the boy's fundamentally sunny disposition despite the strange, isolated circumstances of his upbringing, that Orochimaru found himself endlessly grateful for, though he rarely allowed himself to dwell too long on the sentiment. He should not be this happy, Orochimaru thought sometimes, watching Naruto chase dragonflies through the valley's tall grass during rare breaks from training. Raised in isolation, carrying a burden he does not yet fully understand, denied the ordinary comforts of a normal childhood, and yet he laughs as though the world has given him everything he could ever want. It was, Orochimaru suspected, simply Naruto's nature. Some fundamental resilience woven into the boy's spirit that no amount of hardship seemed capable of dimming. Orochimaru found himself, more and more, structuring his teaching around preserving that resilience rather than merely building skill atop it, understanding, in some intuitive way he could not have articulated even to himself, that Naruto's unshakable optimism was as valuable an asset as any technique he might learn. Up, Orochimaru said, extending a hand to help Naruto back to his feet. Once more. This time, do not think about holding the leaf in place. Simply allow your chakra to settle, the way water settles into stillness once you stop disturbing it. Naruto took a breath, closed his eyes, and tried again. This time, the leaf remained in place for nearly 10 full seconds before fluttering away, a personal record, and one that earned a rare, genuine smile from his teacher. There, Orochimaru said quietly. Now you understand. Afternoons were reserved for lessons of a different kind, ones that Naruto, if pressed, would have admitted he found considerably less exciting than physical training, but which Orochimaru insisted upon with equal rigor. Chakra, Orochimaru explained, seated across from Naruto at the small wooden table that dominated their kitchen area, a steaming cup of tea between them, Naruto's own cup filled with the sweetened juice Orochimaru had prepared from berries gathered in the surrounding forest, since he maintained a strict policy regarding what he considered appropriate for a growing child to consume, is not merely a resource to be spent. It is the fundamental energy of life itself, drawn from two sources within the body: physical energy, cultivated through exercise and cellular vitality, and spiritual energy, cultivated through discipline, meditation, and experience. Naruto, chin propped on one hand, offered the particular expression of polite endurance that children reserved for lessons they found tedious but had learned not to openly protest. You explained this already? Like 4 times. And I will explain it a 5th time, if necessary, until you have internalized it thoroughly enough to apply it without conscious thought, Orochimaru replied, unbothered. Understanding the theory behind your abilities is as important as developing the abilities themselves. A shinobi who understands why a technique functions can adapt when circumstances change. A shinobi who has only memorized the how will falter the moment reality deviates from their training. He proceeded, over the following hour, to walk Naruto through the basic principles of medical ninjutsu, not with any expectation that a 6-year-old would master such advanced techniques anytime soon, but because Orochimaru firmly believed that early exposure to foundational concepts built pathways in the mind that would accelerate later learning, much as he had theorized years earlier with the boy's exposure to hand seals as an infant. Why do I need to know about healing stuff? Naruto asked, poking at a diagram Orochimaru had sketched showing the basic flow of chakra through the circulatory system. If I want to learn cool fighting techniques? Because understanding how the body can be healed necessarily requires understanding how the body can be harmed, Orochimaru said. And understanding how the body can be harmed makes you a considerably more dangerous opponent, should the need ever arise. Furthermore, a shinobi who understands basic medical principles can save the lives of comrades in the field, which is a skill I consider far more valuable than any flashy technique. Naruto considered this with the particular seriousness he brought to arguments he found genuinely persuasive, even at 6 years old. Okay. That makes sense, I guess. I am gratified by your approval, Orochimaru said dryly, and continued the lesson. These afternoon sessions, more than the physical training, revealed the particular texture of the relationship that had grown between them over 6 years. Orochimaru, patient in ways that would have shocked anyone who had known him during his years in Konoha, genuinely delighting in watching Naruto's mind grasp new concepts, however slowly the process sometimes unfolded. Naruto, for his part, had come to trust his guardian's guidance implicitly, even when the lessons themselves felt tedious or difficult, because 6 years of consistent care had taught him that Orochimaru's demands, however exacting, always came from a place of genuine investment in his well-being. It was, Orochimaru reflected privately, a form of trust he had done very little to deserve during his years in Konoha, where his research colleagues had regarded him with a mixture of respect and wariness that never quite crossed into genuine warmth. Here, in this quiet valley, he had somehow earned something he had never actively sought, and had certainly never expected to value as much as he now did. It was during one such afternoon, roughly 2 months after Naruto's 6th birthday, that Orochimaru decided the time had come to address a subject he had been carefully postponing. Naruto, he said, setting aside the diagram they had been reviewing, there is something we need to discuss. Something about you that you are old enough now to understand, at least in its basic form. Naruto looked up, immediately alert to the shift in his guardian's tone. 6 years of careful observation had made the boy remarkably attuned to Orochimaru's moods, despite Orochimaru's generally controlled demeanor. Is this a bad thing? Naruto asked, with the particular directness that Orochimaru had come to expect and, in some ways, appreciate. It is neither good nor bad, Orochimaru said carefully. It simply is. Do you remember the stories I have told you, about the night I found you? Naruto nodded. Orochimaru had, over the years, shared a carefully edited version of that night with the boy, enough truth to satisfy his curiosity without burdening him prematurely with the full political complexity of the circumstances. Naruto knew there had been an attack on a village. He knew his parents had died protecting that village. He knew Orochimaru had carried him away to keep him safe. What he did not yet know, in full detail, was exactly what had attacked that village, or exactly what had happened to it afterward. There was a creature, Orochimaru continued, choosing his words with the same careful precision he applied to any delicate procedure, an enormous fox, possessing 9 tails, and chakra beyond what almost any living being could naturally produce. This creature attacked the village on the night you were born, and your father, the leader of that village, made an impossible choice to stop it from causing further destruction. Naruto's eyes had gone wide, his usual restless energy stilled entirely by the weight of what he was hearing. What did he do? Orochimaru held the boy's gaze steadily. He sealed the creature away. Inside you. The silence that followed stretched long enough that Orochimaru began to wonder if he had misjudged the timing of this conversation entirely. Naruto sat very still, processing the information with an intensity that seemed, for a moment, older than his 6 years. Is it? Naruto's voice came out smaller than usual. Is it still inside me? Right now, it is, Orochimaru confirmed. Contained by a seal your father designed specifically for the purpose, reinforced by your mother's own considerable skill in the sealing arts. It cannot escape, cannot control you, cannot harm you so long as the seal remains intact. You are not the creature, Naruto. You are simply the one who carries it, much as one might carry a heavy stone without becoming the stone itself. Does that mean I'm dangerous? Naruto asked, and there was something in his voice, a vulnerability Orochimaru rarely heard from the boy, whose default disposition remained relentlessly cheerful despite the strangeness of his upbringing, that made something in Orochimaru's chest tighten uncomfortably. No, Orochimaru said, firmly enough that Naruto's eyes snapped back up to meet his. You are not dangerous, Naruto. You are a 6-year-old boy who enjoys chasing dragonflies and complains about lessons in medical theory. What you carry is dangerous, in the wrong circumstances, under the wrong conditions. But you, the person you are, that is something entirely separate. But the village, Naruto said slowly, working through the implications with visible effort, the one that got attacked. That's where you're from too, right? Would they be scared of me? If they knew? Orochimaru considered his answer carefully, unwilling to lie but equally unwilling to burden the boy with the full weight of political reality before he possessed the maturity to process it properly. Some might be, he admitted. Fear of the unknown, and fear of what happened that night, runs deep in people who lived through such devastation. This is, in part, why we live as we do, away from villages, away from prying eyes, until you are old enough and strong enough to face that fear on your own terms, should you ever choose to. Naruto absorbed this in silence for a long moment, small hands fidgeting with the edge of the table. Do you think it's scary? What's inside me? Orochimaru thought of the fox's chakra signature, the malevolent weight he had sensed pressing against the boundaries of the seal on more than one occasion over the years, the ancient hatred that seemed to simmer beneath Naruto's own considerably gentler nature. I think, he said carefully, that the creature within you has known nothing but captivity and hostility for its entire existence, first at the hands of those who sealed it in others before you, and now within you. I do not know if it can be reasoned with, or whether it will forever remain your enemy, but I believe, someday, you may have the opportunity to find out for yourself, and when that day comes, I have faith that you will approach it with more wisdom and more compassion than most shinobi would ever think to offer such a creature. You really think that? Naruto asked, some of his usual brightness returning at the evident sincerity in Orochimaru's tone. I do, Orochimaru said, and found that he meant it entirely. You have a remarkable capacity for seeing past surface appearances, Naruto. I suspect that capacity will serve you well, whenever the time comes to face what sleeps within you. Naruto seemed to consider this, some of the earlier tension easing from his small shoulders. Okay, he said finally, with the particular resilience that had defined him since infancy. I'm not scared. I mean, maybe a little. But I trust you. If you say I'll figure it out someday, then I believe you. Orochimaru felt something shift in his chest at those words, an emotion he had rarely permitted himself to fully acknowledge, even after 6 years of steadily deepening attachment to the boy across the table from him. "Good," he said, voice slightly rougher than usual. "Now, shall we return to our lesson on chakra circulation, or have you had sufficient heavy conversation for one afternoon?" Naruto managed a small, genuine smile. "Heavy conversation is over. Can we do the fighting stuff again instead?" "After dinner," Orochimaru said, allowing the ghost of a smile to touch his own features. Discipline, Naruto. Even in avoiding uncomfortable conversations. That night, long after Naruto had fallen asleep, Orochimaru sat alone in the outpost's main chamber. Kushina's sealing notes spread once more across his desk, illuminated by a single flickering candle. He had not told Naruto everything. Not the full political complexity of Konoha's council, not the looming threat that other villages and organizations might someday pose to a Jinchuriki of the Nine Tails, and certainly not the strange, unexplained phenomenon he had witnessed years ago, the gravity-defying ripple that still occasionally surfaced in his thoughts, unresolved and increasingly urgent as Naruto's chakra reserves continued their unusual growth. He had, in the years since that incident, made incremental progress in his research. The fragmentary texts he possessed, cross-referenced against Kushina's own extensive notes on Uzumaki chakra properties, suggested a connection to legends so old that most shinobi scholars dismissed them as pure mythology. Stories of a sage who had once wielded eyes capable of manipulating the fundamental forces of creation and destruction, eyes said to be passed down, in exceedingly rare circumstances, to those who carried particularly potent combinations of chakra within them. Uzumaki chakra, dense and vital. Fox chakra, ancient and overwhelming. And whatever third element resides beneath both, waiting. Orochimaru had no proof, not yet, that his suspicions carried any merit beyond speculation. But 6 years of careful observation had convinced him that whatever slept within Naruto's chakra network was neither ordinary nor accidental. The boy's chakra reserves had grown at a pace that defied every developmental benchmark Orochimaru could locate. His control, while still developing, showed flashes of precision far beyond what should have been possible for a child his age. And on rare occasions, moments of intense emotion, moments of genuine strain, Orochimaru had caught brief, fleeting glimpses of something stirring behind Naruto's ordinary blue eyes. A faint shimmer, gone almost before it registered, that reminded him, uncomfortably, of the weathered scroll fragment depicting rippling, patterned eyes he had found so many years ago. Soon, Orochimaru thought, closing Kushina's notes with careful hands. Whatever this is, it draws closer to the surface with each passing year. I must ensure he is prepared, whatever form it eventually takes. He extinguished the candle and made his way toward the small adjoining chamber where Naruto slept, pausing in the doorway to watch the boy's peaceful, steady breathing for a long moment, a habit he had never quite managed to break, even after 6 years of confirming, night after night, that Naruto remained safe and unharmed. "Whatever you become," Orochimaru murmured quietly into the darkness, "I intend to ensure the world finds in you something worth admiring, rather than something worth fearing. That much, at least, I owe both your parents and myself." He closed the door softly and retreated to his own quarters, mind already turning toward the training regimens he would need to develop, the lessons he would need to refine, in preparation for whatever awakening drew steadily closer with each passing season. Outside, beyond the walls of their hidden valley, the world continued its slow turn, Konoha rebuilding in the aftermath of tragedy, political tensions simmering beneath the surface of an uneasy peace, and in the shadows of Konoha's own hierarchy, a man named Danzo continuing his patient, calculating search for advantages no one else in the village had yet thought to seek. But within the walls of that quiet, hidden outpost, none of that mattered yet. There was only a boy growing steadily toward a destiny neither he nor his guardian could fully anticipate, and a former Sannin who had, against every prediction anyone might once have made about his life, found genuine purpose in ensuring that destiny unfolded with as much wisdom and protection as he could possibly provide. The library, if it could even be called that, occupied the deepest chamber of the outpost, a room Orochimaru had carved directly into the valley's bedrock years before Naruto had ever entered his life, reinforced with seals designed to protect its contents from fire, flood, and the slow decay of time itself. It was here, surrounded by scrolls acquired through means he rarely discussed even with himself, that Orochimaru spent increasing portions of his nights while Naruto slept soundly above. The Sage of Six Paths, he murmured, unrolling a scroll so old its edges had begun to crumble despite every preservation technique he had applied over the years. The text was written in a script that predated even the earliest Konoha archives, fragments of a language that had required years of painstaking cross-referencing to translate with any confidence, a figure most scholars consider pure myth. A man said to have brought chakra to the world, to have single-handedly ended a war against a being of pure destruction, to have divided his own power between two sons whose rivalry would echo through every generation that followed. He had first encountered references to this figure decades ago, during his early years of forbidden research into the origins of chakra itself, one thread among hundreds he had pursued in his relentless hunger for understanding. At the time, he had dismissed the sage as exactly what mainstream scholarship considered him: religious embellishment, a convenient origin story invented by ancient peoples to explain phenomena they lacked the sophistication to understand scientifically. He no longer held that certainty. Spread across the stone table before him lay 7 years of accumulated research, scroll fragments acquired from ruined temples, cross-reference translations painstakingly assembled from 3 different dead languages, and more recently, detailed notes drawn from his own careful observation of a 6-year-old boy currently sleeping 2 floors above him. Eyes that see truth beyond deception, Orochimaru read aloud, translating the ancient script with the fluency of long practice. Eyes that command the very forces which bind creation together. Eyes granted only to those chosen by fate to walk the path between legends and mortal. He paused on that final phrase, lips pressing into a thin line. Even in translation, even from a text this old, he found himself uncomfortable with the terminology, a discomfort that had nothing to do with scholarly rigor, and everything to do with a promise he had made to himself regarding how he intended to raise the boy sleeping above. Whatever this text called the bearer of such eyes, Orochimaru had no intention of allowing Naruto to grow into someone who believed himself elevated above ordinary humanity by an accident of chakra and bloodline. Power did not confer worth beyond other people. He had watched enough shinobi corrupted by exactly that delusion to guard fiercely against it taking root in the child he had sworn to protect. He set the phrase aside mentally, filing away the historical claim without adopting its language, and continued reading. The fragment described eyes marked by concentric rings radiating outward from the pupil, eyes said to grant their bearer command over what the ancient text referred to, in terms Orochimaru struggled to translate precisely, as the paths. Attraction and repulsion. The pull of gravity bent to a single will, passage between realms of existence normally separated by impassable boundaries. Command over the very souls of the living and the dead. Impossible, Orochimaru thought, and yet found himself unable to fully dismiss the claim, not after what he had witnessed with his own eyes in that brief, gravity-defying ripple years ago. He rose from his desk and crossed to a smaller shelf, retrieving a leather-bound journal filled with his own careful observations, dates, incidents, chakra readings recorded meticulously over the past 6 years. He flipped through the pages, reviewing entries he had made dozens of times before, searching for patterns he might have previously overlooked. Age 1, 3 months, chakra discharge causes brief localized gravitational anomaly. Not repeated despite extensive testing. Age 3, 2 months, Naruto's eyes briefly exhibit faint shimmer during nightmare. Returns to normal upon waking. Chakra readings during episode show significant spike in density, localized primarily around ocular nerve pathways. Age 4, 8 months, during intense frustration, training failure, brief flare of chakra around eyes observed. Duration under 1 second. No lasting effect detected. Age 5, 11 months, nightmare episode, more severe than previous instances. Naruto's eyes exhibit sustained shimmer for approximately 3 seconds before returning to baseline. Boy reports seeing strange shapes upon waking, unable to describe further. Orochimaru closed the journal slowly, staring at nothing in particular as he turned the pattern over in his mind. 6 recorded incidents, each triggered by moments of significant emotional or physical stress, each showing increasing duration and intensity as Naruto aged. The trajectory was unmistakable, even without definitive proof of what it ultimately pointed toward. Whatever sleeps within him is not static, he thought. It grows alongside him. Strengthens alongside him. And someday, likely sooner than I am prepared for, it will awaken in full. The question that kept him awake most nights was not whether this awakening would occur, but what circumstances would trigger it, and whether he could ensure Naruto possessed sufficient control and stability to survive the transition without being overwhelmed by whatever power emerged. You look tired, Naruto observed the following morning, around a mouthful of the rice and grilled fish Orochimaru had prepared for breakfast. A habit of blunt observation the boy had never quite outgrown, despite years of Orochimaru's mild attempts to encourage more diplomatic phrasing. I was engaged in research, Orochimaru replied, seating himself across the table with his own considerably smaller portion. It required more of my attention than I anticipated. Research about what? Orochimaru considered how much truth the question warranted. He had made a careful practice, over the years, of being honest with Naruto whenever possible, a deliberate counterpoint to the secrecy that necessarily defined so much of their circumstances. But some truths required more preparation than a 6-year-old, however precocious, could reasonably absorb before breakfast. About you, he said finally, which was true without being complete. Specifically, about certain unusual properties of your chakra that I have observed over the years and wish to understand more fully. Naruto paused, chopsticks halfway to his mouth. Unusual how? You recall the conversation we had regarding what you carry within you, Orochimaru said. The fox's chakra represents one unusual element of your development, but I have observed evidence suggesting a second, entirely separate source of unusual chakra, one that appears to be entirely your own, rather than borrowed from the fox. Like what? Orochimaru studied the boy for a long moment, weighing the wisdom of the conversation he was about to initiate. Naruto had proven, time and again, more capable of handling difficult truths than most adults gave children credit for, a resilience Orochimaru had come to trust, even as he remained careful never to burden the boy with more than necessary. Your eyes, he said finally. On several occasions, during moments of significant stress or emotion, I have observed them briefly exhibit unusual characteristics. A faint shimmer, sometimes accompanied by patterns I have not yet been able to fully document. I believe this may be connected to a dormant bloodline trait, one considerably rarer and more powerful than anything documented in modern shinobi history. Naruto set down his chopsticks entirely now, giving the conversation his full attention in the way he reserved for topics he genuinely found compelling rather than merely dutiful. Wait, so I have some kind of secret eye power? Like the Uchiha clan's Sharingan? Orochimaru's eyebrows rose slightly. You are aware of the Sharingan? You mentioned it once, when you were teaching me about different kinds of chakra, Naruto said, with the slightly defensive tone of a child confirming he had, in fact, been paying attention during a lesson he had complained about at the time. So I did, Orochimaru said, filing away a private note of satisfaction at the boy's retention. The Sharingan is, indeed, one point of comparison, though what I suspect you may possess is considerably older and, if my research proves accurate, considerably more powerful. A bloodline trait so rare that most shinobi scholars consider it entirely mythological. How powerful are we talking? Naruto asked, eyes bright with the particular excitement he reserved for anything sounding sufficiently impressive. I do not yet know with certainty, Orochimaru admitted. Ancient texts describe abilities related to gravitational manipulation, extraordinary perception, and other capabilities that, frankly, sound implausible even to a man who has spent his life pursuing forbidden knowledge. I want to be clear with you, Naruto. I am not certain these texts accurately describe what you may eventually develop. I am proceeding on educated speculation, not confirmed fact. But you think it's real, Naruto pressed. You wouldn't have spent all night reading about it if you didn't think it was real. Orochimaru allowed himself a small, wry smile at being so accurately read by a 6-year-old. You know me well. Yes, I believe something significant sleeps within your chakra network, waiting for the proper conditions to fully emerge. Whether it matches the legends I have been studying remains to be seen. So what do we do? Naruto asked, leaning forward with the eager intensity that had defined him since infancy. We prepare, Orochimaru said simply. We continue your training, we deepen your discipline and control, and we ensure that whenever this dormant power chooses to awaken, You possess the foundation necessary to master it rather than be overwhelmed by it. This is not a power to rush toward carelessly, Naruto. If my suspicions prove correct, we may be dealing with forces significant enough to reshape landscapes. Such power, wielded without discipline, could prove catastrophic, to you, and to anyone near you when it awakens. Naruto's excitement dimmed slightly, replaced by the thoughtful seriousness that Orochimaru had come to recognize as the boy genuinely processing weighty information rather than simply performing attentiveness. Okay. I understand. Discipline first. Precisely, Orochimaru said, genuine warmth coloring his usually measured tone. Now finish your breakfast. We have considerably more training to accomplish today, and I suspect very little of it will feel particularly exciting to you. Naruto groaned theatrically but returned to his meal with renewed appetite, the momentary gravity of their conversation already beginning to lighten under the particular resilience that had never once failed him, not once in 6 years of unusual, isolated circumstances. Over the following weeks, Orochimaru adjusted Naruto's training regimen to incorporate elements specifically designed to test and strengthen the boy's emotional regulation, a deliberate strategy born from his research into the pattern of incidents documented in his journal. If the dormant trait activated in response to emotional or physical stress, Orochimaru reasoned that teaching Naruto to manage such stress more effectively might delay a premature, potentially dangerous awakening while simultaneously building the foundation of control necessary to handle the power once it finally emerged. Meditation, Orochimaru announced one morning, gesturing for Naruto to sit across from him on the training ground's soft grass. We will incorporate this into your daily routine, beginning today. Naruto's expression suggested this ranked considerably below the cool fighting stuff in his personal hierarchy of exciting activities. Meditation is just sitting still and being bored, though. Meditation is the deliberate cultivation of mental discipline, Orochimaru corrected, settling into his own cross-legged position with the effortless precision of decades of practice. It teaches the mind to observe emotion without being immediately overwhelmed by it, a skill I consider essential to your development, given what we have discussed regarding your dormant abilities. Fine, Naruto said, with the particular long-suffering sigh he had recently begun deploying with increasing frequency, and settled into a rough approximation of the position Orochimaru demonstrated. Close your eyes, Orochimaru instructed. Focus on your breathing. Do not attempt to control it, merely observe it. When thoughts arise, and they will, particularly at first, acknowledge them without judgment, and allow them to pass, the way clouds pass across an open sky. Naruto's eyes squeezed shut with visible effort, brow furrowed in a way that suggested he was approaching meditation with the same fierce determination he brought to every other challenge Orochimaru presented him, whether or not that determination was strictly appropriate to the exercise's actual goals. You are trying too hard, Orochimaru observed after several minutes, watching the tension evident in the boy's small shoulders. Meditation is not a battle to be won through effort, Naruto. It is a surrender to stillness. I don't know how to surrender to stillness, Naruto muttered, eyes still shut. That doesn't even make sense. Orochimaru allowed himself a quiet chuckle, a sound rare enough that Naruto's eyes snapped open in surprise. No, Orochimaru agreed, I imagine it does not yet. This is a skill that develops with practice, like any other. Do not expect mastery today. Simply begin. They continued the exercise daily, and though Naruto's early attempts remained characteristically restless, fidgeting, sighing, occasionally opening one eye to check how much time had passed, Orochimaru observed gradual improvement over the following weeks. The boy's capacity for stillness extended, incrementally, from mere seconds to full minutes, and Orochimaru began to notice subtle changes in how Naruto responded to frustration during other aspects of his training, a fraction more patience before temper flared, a fraction more composure when a technique failed to work as intended. It was, Orochimaru reflected, exactly the kind of incremental progress that defined most meaningful growth, unglamorous, easily overlooked in the moment, but cumulatively significant when observed across sufficient time. The true test of this developing discipline arrived without warning, roughly 4 months into the new training regimen, on an otherwise unremarkable afternoon. Orochimaru had stepped away briefly to retrieve additional training equipment from the outpost's storage chamber. leaving Naruto to practice a series of basic taijutsu forms independently, a routine exercise the boy had performed dozens of times before without incident. He returned perhaps 10 minutes later to the sound of raised voices, and emerged from the outpost to find Naruto facing off against an unfamiliar figure at the edge of their training ground. Orochimaru's entire body went rigid with alarm before conscious thought fully caught up to instinct, chakra already gathering at his fingertips in preparation for combat. The stranger, a wiry man in traveling clothes, bearing no obvious shinobi insignia but moving with the unmistakable coiled readiness of someone trained in combat, had one hand extended toward Naruto in what might have been a threatening gesture or might simply have been an attempt at intimidation. It was impossible, in that first frozen instant, to determine which. Naruto! Orochimaru's voice cracked across the clearing like a whip, and both figures turned toward him, the stranger's expression shifting rapidly from confidence to alarm as he registered exactly who had just appeared. You, the stranger said, taking an involuntary step backward. Orochimaru of the Sannin. I had heard rumors, but Orochimaru did not wait to hear the remainder of that sentence. He crossed the distance between them in a blur of motion, placing himself firmly between Naruto and the stranger with a fluid practice ease that spoke to decades of combat experience. Explain yourself, Orochimaru said, voice dropping to a register that had, in his years as a Konoha shinobi, preceded considerable violence toward those unwise enough to test his patience. Now, before my patience expires entirely. The stranger raised both hands in a gesture of placation, though his eyes darted nervously toward Naruto, whom Orochimaru could sense, even without turning to check, standing tense and alert several feet behind him. I meant no harm. I am a simple traveler, merely passing through this region, and the boy startled me as much as I apparently startled him. I asked only for directions to the nearest village. Orochimaru studied the man's chakra signature carefully, senses honed by decades of assessing threats accurately and quickly. Beneath the surface calm, he detected trained control, the disciplined chakra flow of someone who had received at least moderate shinobi training, inconsistent with a simple traveler, whatever the man's cover story claimed. A scout, Orochimaru thought grimly. Sent by whom, I cannot yet determine. But this was no accidental encounter. You will leave this region immediately, Orochimaru said, voice carrying the particular cold finality that had once made him one of the most feared shinobi in the Land of Fire. And you will inform whoever sent you that this valley, and everyone within it, remains under protection that will prove considerably more costly to challenge than whatever reward you were promised for this reconnaissance. The stranger's composure cracked entirely at this, confirming Orochimaru's suspicions beyond any reasonable doubt. Without further protest, he turned and fled into the surrounding forest, moving with the speed of someone whose combat training, whatever its origin, remained considerably outmatched by the man he had just encountered. Orochimaru watched him disappear into the tree line, mind already racing through possibilities. Konoha intelligence gathering, opportunistic bounty hunters aware of his own considerable reputation, or something considerably more concerning that he did not yet have enough information to fully evaluate. It was only when he turned back to check on Naruto that he registered exactly what had happened during those tense moments of confrontation, and felt his blood run cold with an entirely different kind of alarm. Naruto stood exactly where Orochimaru had left him, but his posture had none of its usual restless energy. His small fists remained clenched at his sides, his entire body rigid with what Orochimaru immediately recognized as barely restrained fear transformed into something considerably more volatile. And his eyes, wide fixed on the spot where the stranger had vanished into the forest, held a faint, unmistakable shimmer, concentric patterns rippling faintly across irises that had, moments before, been their ordinary shade of blue. Naruto, Orochimaru said carefully, crossing the remaining distance between them with deliberate slowness, hands raised in the same placating gesture the stranger had offered moments before, though for entirely different reasons. Look at me. Breathe. Remember what we have practiced. Naruto's gaze snapped toward him, and for one suspended moment, Orochimaru found himself looking into eyes that were not quite his ward's ordinary blue, pale, rippling, ancient in a way that seemed almost impossible in the face of a frightened 6-year-old. I felt something, Naruto said, voice shaking slightly. When he pointed at me. Something in my chest, like it wanted to, He stopped, visibly struggling to articulate a sensation he lacked the vocabulary to properly describe. I don't know. Push. Push him away. That is precisely what we have discussed, Orochimaru said, keeping his voice deliberately calm despite the racing pulse of his own alarm, kneeling down to bring himself to Naruto's eye level. The dormant power we spoke of. It responded to your fear, your instinct to protect yourself. This is exactly why we have been practicing discipline and control, so that when moments like this occur, you are equipped to manage what emerges rather than being overwhelmed by it. Is it gone now? Naruto asked, blinking rapidly, and Orochimaru watched with careful attention as the faint shimmer in the boy's eyes gradually receded, irises settling back into their familiar, ordinary blue. It appears so, Orochimaru confirmed, relief evident despite his efforts to maintain composure for Naruto's benefit. You did well, Naruto. You felt something powerful and frightening stirring within you, and you did not lose yourself to it. That is precisely the discipline we have been building these past months. Naruto managed a shaky, uncertain smile, still visibly processing the intensity of what had just occurred. That was scary. Yes, Orochimaru agreed, pulling the boy into a brief, uncharacteristic embrace that surprised them both slightly, though either commented on it. It was, but you handled it with more composure than many trained shinobi managed during their first encounter with genuinely dangerous power. I am proud of you. The words settled something in Naruto's posture, tension easing from his small shoulders as he leaned briefly into the embrace before pulling back, some of his usual resilience already reasserting itself. Does this mean the eye power thing is definitely real? Like, for sure now? It appears so, Orochimaru confirmed, rising back to his full height, mind already racing ahead toward the considerable implications of what he had just witnessed. Confirmation, at last, beyond mere speculation and fragmentary ancient texts. Whatever slept within Naruto's chakra network was neither myth nor misinterpretation. It was real, it was growing stronger, and it had just responded, however briefly, to a genuine external threat. And that stranger, Orochimaru thought grimly, gaze drifting back toward the tree line where the man had vanished, witnessed at least a fragment of it, however brief. The reconnaissance, whoever had ordered it, had likely learned considerably more than Orochimaru would have preferred. The question now was who, precisely, that intelligence would reach, and how quickly they would need to prepare for the consequences. That night, after Naruto had finally settled into uneasy sleep, the day's events having left him more shaken than he readily admitted, Orochimaru sat once more in his hidden library. Kushina's notes, and the ancient scroll fragments spread before him with renewed urgency. Two threats now converge, he thought, mind working through the implications with the same rigorous precision he applied to any complex problem. An unknown power awakening within him, unpredictable and difficult to control. And an outside world that has just received confirmation something unusual exists within this valley. He thought of Sarutobi, wondered whether whatever intelligence that scout gathered would eventually reach Konoha's ears, wondered whether the village that had once nearly consumed Naruto in fear before he had even drawn his first breath now stood poised to discover exactly what it had lost, and exactly what threat, or asset, that loss represented. He thought, too, of other possibilities considerably more concerning than Konoha's own political machinations, organizations that hunted Jinchuriki for reasons that had nothing to do with protection and everything to do with exploitation. Rumors, still fragmentary and unconfirmed, of a group forming in the shadows with interests in tailed beasts that extended far beyond any single village's borders. I have perhaps months, not years, to prepare him, Orochimaru realized, the weight of that timeline settling heavily across his shoulders. Whatever power resides within him, whatever threats now circle closer to discovering him, I must accelerate his training considerably beyond what I had originally planned. He rose from his desk and made his way, once more, to the doorway of Naruto's small chamber, watching the boy's restless sleep with the particular vigilance that had defined 6 years of quiet, dedicated protection. I promised your parents' memory that I would give you the chance the world would never willingly offer, he murmured into the darkness. I do not intend to break that promise now, whatever forces begin circling closer to discovering what you truly are. He closed the door softly, mind already turning toward the considerable work ahead, accelerated training regimens, deeper research into whatever ancient power stirred within his ward, and, Perhaps most urgently, careful consideration of exactly how much longer their current hiding place could realistically remain secure. The quiet years of their life together, Orochimaru understood with growing certainty, were drawing rapidly to a close. 3 weeks after the encounter with the mysterious traveler, Orochimaru made a decision he had been circling for days without fully committing to. It was time to relocate. "We're moving again?" Naruto asked, watching with a mixture of resignation and curiosity, as Orochimaru carefully packed scroll after scroll into reinforced storage cases, the library slowly emptying around them. This would be their third relocation in Naruto's memory, though he had been too young to recall the first. "It is a precaution," Orochimaru said, not looking up from his work. "That man who approached you was not simply lost, whatever he claimed. I do not yet know who sent him, but I do not intend to wait here and find out through unpleasant confirmation." "Where are we going?" "North," Orochimaru said. "There is a location I identified some years ago, deeper into less traveled territory, near the borders of the land of rivers. More defensible. More isolated." He paused in his packing, glancing toward Naruto with an expression that carried more gravity than the boy was accustomed to seeing outside of their most serious conversations. "I would prefer to have completed this move already. Circumstances have made that impossible. We depart in 2 days. 2 days, it would turn out, was 1 day too many." They came at dusk, when the light had softened into that uncertain gray that made shapes harder to distinguish and shadows longer than they should have been. Orochimaru sensed them before he saw them. 5 distinct chakra signatures, moving with the disciplined coordination of a trained unit rather than the scattered, uncertain presence of ordinary travelers. He had been in the process of securing the last of the outpost's sensitive materials when the sensation hit him, cold and immediate. Every instinct honed across decades of shinobi experience screaming a single word: "Hunters, Naruto." His voice cut through the outpost's quiet with an urgency that brought the boy running from the adjoining chamber, alarmed by a tone he had rarely heard from his guardian. "We have visitors. Stay behind me, and do exactly as I say. No deviation. Do you understand?" Naruto's eyes went wide, but 6 years of training had instilled enough discipline that he did not question, simply nodded and fell into position at Orochimaru's back as they moved toward the outpost's entrance. The 5 figures who emerged from the tree line wore no obvious village insignia, but their coordinated movement and the quality of their equipment told Orochimaru everything he needed to know. Hunternin, or something functionally equivalent, professionals, dispatched with a specific target in mind, moving with the confidence of a team that had prepared thoroughly before engaging. "Orochimaru of the Sannin," the lead figure said, a broad-shouldered man with a scarred jaw and eyes that carried the flat, calculating assessment of someone who had killed many times before and felt nothing particular about the prospect of doing so again. "You have been remarkably difficult to locate. Our employer will be pleased." "Your employer," Orochimaru said, voice carrying the cold, measured quality that had once made lesser shinobi flee rather than face him in combat, made a significant error in judgment, sending only 5 of you. The scarred man's expression flickered with something that might have been amusement, or might simply have been contempt. "We were not sent for you, Sannin. Your reputation, considerable as it remains, is not our primary interest tonight." His gaze shifted, deliberate and pointed, past Orochimaru's shoulder to where Naruto stood, small and tense, watching the confrontation with wide, alert eyes. "The boy is..." Something cold and absolute settled over Orochimaru in that instant, not fear, precisely, but a crystallizing focus that stripped away every extraneous thought except the singular priority of ensuring the child behind him survived the next several minutes. "Then you have made a fatal miscalculation," Orochimaru said quietly, "believing yourselves capable of taking him from me while I still draw a breath." "We were warned you might feel that way," the scarred man replied, and gestured with 2 fingers. The other 4 figures moved simultaneously, spreading into a coordinated formation that spoke to extensive prior planning. This was not an opportunistic strike, but a deliberate operation, designed specifically to overwhelm exactly the kind of threat Orochimaru represented. Orochimaru did not wait for them to complete their positioning. He moved first, closing the distance to the nearest attacker with a burst of speed that belied his relaxed posture only a moment before, a kunai already gathering chakra along its edge as he closed the gap. The attacker, clearly experienced, though not experienced enough, barely managed to deflect the strike, staggering backward from the force of the blow. "Naruto, back toward the ridge line," Orochimaru called, voice sharp with command even as he pivoted to intercept a second attacker closing from his flank. "Now." Naruto hesitated only a fraction of a second before obeying, scrambling backward across the clearing even as the battle around him escalated into a blur of motion and clashing chakra. He had trained for years under Orochimaru's exacting instruction, had learned discipline and control and the beginnings of genuine combat skill. But he had never faced anything like this. 5 trained killers converging on the only home he had ever known, and every instinct in his small body screamed with a fear he had no framework for processing. Orochimaru fought with the ruthless efficiency of a man who had spent decades honing his combat abilities alongside his research, cutting down one attacker with a precise strike to a vital point before the man had even fully registered the danger. But 5 coordinated shinobi, however individually outmatched, represented a genuine tactical challenge even for someone of Orochimaru's considerable skill, and the scarred leader, hanging back from the initial engagement, watched with the patient calculation of someone who understood that attrition, not individual skill, would ultimately decide this confrontation. "You cannot fight all of us and protect him simultaneously," the scarred man called out, as 2 more of his subordinates pressed their attack from opposite directions, forcing Orochimaru into an increasingly defensive posture. "Surrender the boy, and you may yet walk away from this." "I have already answered that proposal," Orochimaru snarled, chakra flaring visibly around him as he unleashed a technique that sent one attacker flying backward into the tree line with bone-jarring force. But even as he dispatched a third opponent, he felt the cost of sustained combat beginning to accumulate. A shallow cut along his forearm, chakra reserves drawn down faster than he would have preferred. The accumulated strain of fighting multiple skilled opponents simultaneously without pause. It was in this moment of mounting difficulty that the scarred leader finally moved, abandoning his patient observation in favor of direct engagement, closing the distance toward Orochimaru with a speed that suggested he had been deliberately concealing his true capability until the optimal moment. Orochimaru, already engaged with his 4th opponent, registered the threat a fraction of a second too late. The strike caught him across the ribs, not a killing blow, but a serious one, chakra-infused force that cracked bone and drove the breath from his lungs in a single devastating impact. He staggered, vision swimming momentarily, and in that brief window of vulnerability, the scarred leader pressed his advantage, a second strike aimed with lethal precision toward Orochimaru's exposed throat. "Orochimaru!" Naruto's scream tore across the clearing, raw with a terror that transcended every careful lesson in emotional discipline he had absorbed over 6 years of patient training. What happened next occurred faster than conscious thought could fully process. Orochimaru, twisting desperately to avoid the fatal strike, felt the blow connect regardless. A glancing hit rather than the clean kill the scarred man had intended, but enough to send him crashing to the ground, breath knocked entirely from his body, dark spots crowding the edges of his vision. He was aware, distantly, of the scarred man turning from his fallen target toward the boy who had screamed his name, recalculating, perhaps, that a wounded Orochimaru no longer represented the priority threat, that the actual objective of this entire operation remained standing, small and undefended, at the edge of the clearing. He was aware, too, of Naruto's small form no longer frozen in terror, but moving, not fleeing, as every instinct should have demanded, but running toward the fallen figure of his guardian, placing himself directly between Orochimaru and the approaching threat with a desperate, fierce determination that belied his 6 years entirely. "Get away from him!" Naruto screamed, small fists clenched, tears streaming down a face contorted with a terror that had, in the span of seconds, transformed into something far more volatile. The scarred man's approach did not slow. "Move aside, boy, and I may yet allow you to live long enough to regret disloyalty," I said. Naruto's voice cracked, raw and desperate. "Get away from him." What happened next? Orochimaru would spend the following weeks attempting to fully reconstruct from fragmented, adrenaline-blurred memory, cross-referencing his own observations against every text he had painstakingly studied over the past 6 years. The air around Naruto seemed to shift, not visually, not at first, but in some fundamental, physical sense that every trained shinobi in that clearing registered instinctively. A pressure building that had nothing to do with ordinary chakra discharge and everything to do with something far older, far more absolute. The scarred man's approach faltered, some deep survival instinct screaming warning even before his conscious mind fully processed what was happening. Then Naruto's eyes opened fully, and the world, quite literally, changed shape around him. Where ordinary blue had existed moments before, something else now looked out at the clearing, pale violet irises marked by concentric rings radiating outward from the pupil, ancient and utterly unmistakable even to a man who had spent years theorizing about exactly this possibility without ever quite believing he would witness it firsthand. The Rinnegan. The scarred man, 3 feet from Naruto and closing, found his forward momentum abruptly, violently arrested, not by any physical obstacle, but by an invisible force that seized his entire body and pulled, gravity itself bending around a 6-year-old boy standing at the center of a phenomenon that defied every law of nature the shinobi world understood. He was flung backward with bone-shattering force, crashing through the trunk of a mature tree as though it were made of paper, coming to rest in a crumpled, unmoving heap nearly 30 feet from where he had stood a moment before. The remaining attackers, the 2 still capable of combat, having recovered from their earlier engagement with Orochimaru, froze in place, staring at the small figure now standing alone in the clearing's center, violet eyes blazing with power that seemed, impossibly, to be growing rather than diminishing with each passing second. What, one of them breathed, is that? Naruto did not answer. He did not, in truth, seem entirely aware of the question, or of anything beyond the singular, desperate need to protect the fallen figure behind him. His small hands trembled, chakra visibly gathering and coiling around him in patterns that Orochimaru, even through the pain and dizziness of his own injuries, recognized with growing, horrified awe as something approaching the fundamental manipulation of natural forces described in texts he had considered, until this very moment, at least partially mythological. Naruto, Orochimaru managed, forcing himself upright despite the grinding pain in his ribs, voice raw with urgency. Naruto, listen to me. You need to. He did not manage to finish the sentence. The nearest remaining attacker, recovering enough composure to act, lunged toward Naruto with a strike clearly intended to end the threat before it could fully manifest. Naruto's response was immediate, instinctive, terrifyingly absolute. One small hand extended, palm open, and the word that left his lips carried a weight and clarity utterly incongruous with his age, as though something far older and more practiced spoke through him in that singular, desperate moment. Shinra Tensei. The technique's name meant nothing to Naruto consciously. He had never studied it, never heard it spoken by Orochimaru or read of it in any text he had access to. And yet it emerged from him with perfect, instinctive precision, as though the knowledge existed not in his mind, but in something deeper, older, encoded into the very chakra that now poured from him in overwhelming waves. The resulting shockwave of pure repulsive force tore through the clearing with cataclysmic power, uprooting trees, cratering earth, and sending the remaining attacker flying with such violence that Orochimaru, even in his wounded state, understood immediately the man would not be rising again. Silence fell across the devastated clearing, broken only by Naruto's ragged, uneven breathing and the settling dust of what had, moments before, been an ordinary training ground. Orochimaru forced himself fully upright, ignoring the protest of cracked ribs, and made his way unsteadily toward the small figure still standing at the center of the destruction, violet eyes now beginning to waver, exhaustion visibly overtaking whatever ancient power had briefly seized control of his small body. Naruto, Orochimaru said, voice gentle despite the urgency underlying it, reaching the boy just as his knees finally buckled, catching him before he could collapse fully to the ruined earth. I have you. You are safe now. Naruto's violet eyes, already fading, rings dissolving back into ordinary blue even as Orochimaru watched, turned up toward him, unfocused and clearly exhausted beyond anything the boy had ever experienced. I felt them, Naruto whispered, voice barely audible. I felt them trying to hurt you, and something just happened. I didn't mean to. I don't know what I did. You saved my life, Orochimaru said, cradling the boy carefully against his chest, mindful of his own injuries, but entirely unwilling to release his grip on the small, exhausted form now trembling in his arms. Whatever occurred here, whatever power you just unleashed, it saved both of us. I need you to rest now. Can you do that for me? Naruto managed only a small, fading nod before his eyes closed entirely. consciousness surrendering to the overwhelming toll of an awakening no 6-year-old should have been forced to endure under such violent circumstances. Orochimaru held him close, surveying the devastated clearing around them with an expression caught between profound relief and dawning, almost overwhelming realization. The Rinnegan, he thought, staring at the crater where a fully grown, trained shinobi had simply ceased to exist under the force of a technique that legend claimed had not been witnessed in over 1,000 years. He truly carries the eyes of the sage himself. The scarred leader, he noted grimly, remained motionless where he had landed against the shattered tree trunk. Whether dead or merely unconscious, Orochimaru could not immediately determine, and did not currently possess the strength to investigate thoroughly. The other attackers showed no signs of life beyond the ragged, shallow breathing that suggested severe injury rather than immediate death. Whoever sent them will learn, eventually, exactly what happened here tonight, Orochimaru thought, exhaustion and pain beginning to catch up with the adrenaline that had carried him through the confrontation. And when they do, the world will understand precisely what Naruto Uzumaki has become. The thought carried equal parts triumph and profound, gnawing dread. He carried Naruto back into the outpost with considerable difficulty, his own injuries protesting every step, and laid the boy carefully in his bed before allowing himself the luxury of properly assessing the damage to his own body. Cracked ribs, as he had suspected, along with the shallow cut across his forearm and considerable chakra exhaustion from the sustained combat. Nothing life-threatening, provided he took the time to properly heal, time he was not entirely certain circumstances would allow him. He spent the following hour applying what medical ninjutsu he could manage in his depleted state, wrapping his ribs with practiced efficiency, before finally allowing himself to sit at Naruto's bedside and simply breathe through the aftermath of what had very nearly been a catastrophic loss. 5 trained hunters, he thought, staring at the sleeping boy's peaceful face, still faintly marked by the exhaustion of an awakening that had asked far too much of a body still years away from adulthood. Dispatched by someone with sufficient resources and intelligence to locate our position despite years of careful concealment. This was not a random encounter. This was deliberate, planned, and specifically targeted. The question that mattered now, more urgently than any other, was who precisely had sent them, and whether their failure tonight would prompt an escalated response, or a temporary retreat while whoever orchestrated this attack recalculated their approach in light of what Naruto had just revealed himself capable of. He rose carefully, wincing against the protest of his injured ribs, and made his way to the outpost's small window, gazing out at the moonlit devastation still visible across what remained of their training ground. 3 fallen shinobi, at minimum. Possibly all 5, though he had not yet confirmed the final casualty count with certainty. This will not remain secret, he thought grimly. Word of what happened here tonight will travel, regardless of how carefully we attempt to conceal it. Someone dispatched a coordinated team. Someone will notice when that team fails to return, or returns considerably diminished, with stories of a 6-year-old wielding power thought lost to legend. The relocation he had planned for 2 days from now suddenly felt inadequate to the scale of the threat they now faced. This was no longer a matter of simple caution against a single suspicious traveler. This was confirmation that powerful, resourceful forces had already identified Naruto as a target worth significant investment to acquire, and had now received, however violently, proof that their target possessed capabilities far beyond what any reasonable intelligence assessment could have anticipated. Everything changes from here, Orochimaru thought, returning to his position at Naruto's bedside, settling into the quiet vigil he intended to maintain throughout whatever remained of the night. The gentle years of careful, hidden growth are finished. Whatever comes next demands considerably more than patient discipline and careful theory. It demands preparation for a world that now, however unwillingly, knows something of what he carries. Naruto slept through the remainder of that night and well into the following day, his body and chakra network recovering from an exertion that had, by any reasonable measure, been almost catastrophically premature. Orochimaru remained at his bedside for the majority of that time, alternating between careful medical monitoring and the grim, necessary work of assessing the full scope of what had transpired in their training ground. 2 of the 5 attackers, he confirmed upon a cautious daylight investigation, had died from injuries sustained during Naruto's awakening, the scarred leader among them, his body having struck the shattered tree trunk with force sufficient to end his life almost instantly. A third remained unconscious, severely injured, and Orochimaru made the calculated decision to interrogate the man once his condition stabilized enough to survive the process, extracting whatever intelligence could be gleaned regarding who, precisely, had commissioned this attack. The remaining 2 attackers had apparently fled during the chaos, their fate and eventual destination unknown, a loose end that troubled Orochimaru considerably, given the certainty that whatever information they carried back to their employer would only accelerate whatever plans had prompted this attack in the first place. It was late afternoon when Naruto finally stirred, blinking slowly awake in the dim light of his small chamber, disoriented and clearly still exhausted despite the extended rest. Orochimaru? His voice came out rough, uncertain. What happened? I remember. He stopped, brow furrowing as fragmented memory apparently began reassembling itself. I remember being scared. Really scared. And then everything felt really strange, like I wasn't fully in control of my own body. You awakened your bloodline, Orochimaru said gently, settling onto the edge of the bed beside him. The dormant power we have spent years anticipating. It emerged in response to genuine, mortal danger, to both of us. Naruto's eyes widened as more fragments of memory apparently surfaced. The people who attacked us. Are they? He hesitated, visibly working through a question he seemed almost afraid to voice. Did I hurt them? Orochimaru considered his answer carefully, unwilling to lie but equally unwilling to burden the boy with unnecessary guilt over actions taken in desperate defense of both their lives. You defended us, Naruto, against people who intended to take you from me by whatever violent means necessary, and who very nearly succeeded in killing me in the process. What happened to them was the direct consequence of their own choice to attack an innocent child and his guardian. You bear no fault for defending yourself against that threat. But did I? Naruto's voice cracked slightly. Did I kill them? Orochimaru held the boy's gaze steadily, understanding the genuine weight behind the question. The fear of a child confronting, for the first time, the true cost of the power he carried. 2 of the 5 did not survive the encounter, he said finally, choosing honesty over comfortable evasion. This is a difficult truth, Naruto, and I will not pretend otherwise. But I want you to understand something important. Those men came to this valley with the explicit intention of taking you by force, likely killing me in the process, and delivering you to whoever commissioned their mission for purposes I sincerely doubt were benevolent. You did not choose this confrontation. They did, and when it came to protecting your own life and mine, your power responded exactly as it needed to. Naruto absorbed this in silence for a long moment, small hands twisting anxiously in the blanket covering him. It doesn't feel good, he said finally, voice small. Even if they were bad guys, it doesn't feel good knowing I did that. It should not feel good, Orochimaru said, with a gentleness that surprised even himself. The day taking a life feels comfortable to you is the day I will have failed most profoundly as your guardian. This weight you feel, Naruto, this discomfort, this grief even for those who meant us harm. This is precisely the quality that will keep you from becoming the kind of person who wields power carelessly, or worse, gladly. I do not ever want that weight to fully disappear. I simply want you to learn to carry it without being crushed beneath it. Naruto managed a small, uncertain nod, some of the raw fear in his expression gradually settling into something more like exhausted acceptance. What do we do now? Now, Orochimaru said, we prepare. What happened last night confirms that dangerous forces have already identified you as a target of considerable interest, and now possess direct evidence of exactly what capabilities you carry. We can no longer rely solely on hiding, Naruto. We must also ensure that you develop sufficient mastery over this power to protect yourself, should circumstances ever again demand it. The Rinnegan, Naruto said slowly, testing the unfamiliar word. That's what you called it, right? When I was fighting? I did not call it anything during the confrontation, Orochimaru said, faint surprise coloring his tone. Do you recall speaking during the encounter? Naruto's brow furrowed with the effort of memory. I think I said something. A word. I don't really remember choosing to say it, it just kind of came out. Orochimaru filed this observation away with careful, growing fascination. Shinra Tensei, he said quietly, the name of the technique you employed, drawn from ancient legend describing the abilities of the Sage of Six Paths himself. That you spoke this name instinctively, without prior instruction, suggests the knowledge exists within you at a level considerably deeper than conscious learning, encoded, perhaps, into the very chakra pathways associated with the Rinnegan itself. So I already know stuff about it? Naruto asked, some of his natural curiosity beginning to resurface despite the day's heavy events. Without even learning it first? Perhaps fragments, Orochimaru said carefully. Instinctive knowledge is rarely a substitute for genuine mastery, however. What you accessed last night was raw, unguided power responding to desperate need. Learning to wield it with genuine control and precision will require considerably more disciplined effort than simply waiting for danger to unlock instinct once again. Naruto absorbed this with visible determination, some of the fear from earlier in their conversation gradually transforming into the familiar, fierce resolve that had defined him since infancy. Okay, then let's start. I don't want to almost lose you again because I don't know how to control this. Orochimaru felt something tighten in his chest at the boy's words, pride, certainly, but also a fierce, protective resolve of his own, hardened by the near catastrophe of the previous night into something considerably more absolute than it had been before. We will begin as soon as you have fully recovered your strength, he said. But Naruto, I want you to understand something important before we proceed further. What you carry within you is not merely a weapon to be mastered. It is, if the legends I have studied prove accurate, among the most significant powers this world has ever known. Wielded carelessly, it could cause catastrophic harm. Wielded with wisdom and discipline, it could reshape the very course of the shinobi world. The choice of which path you walk will always, ultimately, belong to you. Naruto met his guardian's gaze with a seriousness that belied his 6 years, something in his expression carrying the weight of a boy who had, in the span of a single violent night, been forced to grow considerably beyond his years. Then help me choose the right path, he said quietly. Please, that, Orochimaru said, reaching out to gently ruffle the boy's wild hair with a tenderness he rarely displayed so openly, is precisely what I intend to do. Outside the outpost, beneath a sky slowly clearing of the previous night's violence, the devastated training ground stood as silent testament to power the shinobi world had not witnessed in 1,000 years. Power that had just, unmistakably, announced its return. Word of what had transpired that night would take time to travel, filtered through whatever remained of the fleeing attackers and whatever intelligence network had commissioned their failed mission. But travel it would, inevitably, carrying with it a single, world-altering truth that would soon begin reshaping the calculations of power players across every corner of the shinobi world. The eyes of the Sage of Six Paths had returned, and they belonged to a 6-year-old boy who had no interest whatsoever in ruling, conquering, or dominating anyone, only in protecting the one person who had ever truly loved him, and learning to carry a burden that history itself had warned was never meant to rest easily upon any single set of shoulders.